I've been driving for rideshare services for a few years now, mostly sticking to late-night shifts. The roads are quieter, the fares are better, and the tips can be surprisingly generous. But there's a trade-off. The later it gets, the weirder things tend to become. Drunk passengers, lost tourists, and even the occasional argument in the back seat. I've seen it all. Or at least I thought I had. Nothing, and I mean nothing, even came close to what happened that one night. This was a few months ago. At the time, I didn't have a dash cam, something I now deeply regret. It started like any other shift. Just me, the occasional car passing by, and the low hum of my aging 2005 Volvo. It's old, a little rough around the edges, but reliable as ever. I had been driving for a few hours already, watching the streets slowly empty as the night stretched on. Then, sometime after 2 a.m., a ride request popped up. The location was a convenience store not too far away. Seemed simple enough, so I accepted it without much thought. But as I got closer, a weird feeling settled in my stomach. You ever get that deep, gut-level sense that something just isn't right? That was me as I pulled up. I didn't even know why at first, but then it hit me. The store was completely dark. The parking lot was empty, the neon signs were off, and the place was clearly closed for the night. Yet someone was waiting outside. I slowed down to get a better look at him. He was pacing back and forth in front of the store, moving erratically like he was full of nervous energy. His hoodie was so filthy it looked like it hadn't seen a washing machine in years, and there was a hole in the sleeve. His whole body language screamed unease, jerky movements, constant glances over his shoulder, shifting from foot to foot. If I had to guess, he was either tweaking on something or paranoid out of his mind. I should have canceled the ride. I even hovered my finger over the button, debating whether I should just drive away. But I hesitated. I don't even know why. Maybe I didn't want to assume the worst about him, or maybe I just wasn't thinking straight. Against my better judgment, I unlocked the doors. He slid into the back seat without a word. No greeting, no acknowledgement. Just silence. The second I pulled away from the curb, I regretted my decision. Most passengers either get on their phones, stare out the window, or make small talk. Not him. He sat dead still, staring at me through the rearview mirror. Not blinking. Not looking away. Just staring. His eyes were locked on mine every time I glanced up. Trying to ignore him, I reached for the radio, figuring some background noise might help break the unbearable silence. The moment music started playing, he snapped. "Turn it off." His voice was deep, raspy, and edged with something unsettling. Startled, my hands jerked on the wheel slightly, but I complied, switching the radio off without saying a word. We drove in complete silence for a while. I tried to focus on the road, on the GPS, on anything but his unwavering stare. Then, out of nowhere, he spoke. "Ever pick up someone you shouldn't have?" The question sent a chill down my spine. I forced out an awkward chuckle and said something dumb like, "Well, I hope not." I was trying to keep it light, but he didn't react. He just leaned back and muttered something under his breath that I couldn't quite catch. Then he started rambling. He told me he used to be a driver too. Said he quit after some punk stole from his car. His words slurred together a little, making it hard to understand everything, but I got the gist of it. What unsettled me the most was the way he told the story, with a grin. Not an amused grin, not even an angry one. Just this eerie, unfitting smile like he was reliving a fond memory. It was unnerving, but what really got me was what he said next. "Funny, isn't it? How much trust you put in someone sitting right behind you." I felt my grip tighten on the wheel. My heart started racing. He wasn't just some high-strung guy with a bad past, he was a potential threat. And the worst part? There wasn't a damn thing I could do about it. The rest of the ride was a blur of him rambling. Sometimes nonsense, sometimes disturbing half-sentences. He kept apologizing, not to me but to someone who wasn't there. "I didn't mean it," he whispered repeatedly, his voice growing more frantic with each utterance. "I didn't mean it. I didn't mean it. I didn't mean it." We were minutes from his drop-off point when he suddenly snapped out of his trance. His head shot up. "You missed my turn." "I didn't." The GPS was clear. But before I could say anything, he barked at me to pull over. My instincts screamed at me not to, but my fear won out. I slammed on the brakes, my hands trembling. As soon as I shifted into park, a bright light illuminated my rearview mirror. A police car. It was rolling slowly down the street, its spotlight briefly sweeping over my car. The guy in my back seat immediately slouched down, sinking almost completely out of sight. He lay there perfectly still, eyes shut. I didn't dare look at him directly. My pulse pounded in my ears. The police car rolled past us and disappeared around the corner. Then, without a word, my passenger sat back up. He looked at me through the mirror, that eerie smile returning. "You got lucky." Before I could react, he popped open the door and vanished into the night. I sat there, frozen, watching him disappear into the shadows. My hands were shaking. I ended my shift early that night. Weeks later, I was scrolling through the news when a headline caught my eye. A convenience store had been robbed a few blocks from where I had picked that guy up. The timestamp matched almost exactly. My stomach turned. I had been alone in my car with a criminal. Maybe worse. I thought about reporting it, but I have my own reasons for keeping my distance from the police. And honestly, what would I even say? That I drove some guy around who gave me a bad feeling? I'll never know for sure what he had done, or what he was capable of doing to me that night. But I do know one thing: I never drive without a dash cam anymore. And I'm a hell of a lot more careful about who I let into my car. I used to live in the city. The urban lifestyle was everything I had ever envisioned for myself. But after an extremely traumatic experience, everything changed. I won't go into details, but it left me unable to tolerate even the smallest noises. Every sound felt like a jolt straight to my nerves. My psychiatrist told me I had developed a rare case of phonophobia. Imagine the pins and needles sensation when your foot falls asleep, except in your chest, constantly, like my body was bracing for something that wasn't coming. I couldn't keep living like that. About 3 years ago, I found a cabin buried deep in the Pacific Northwest. I won't say exactly where for reasons that will soon become clear, but it was somewhere in Oregon. It seemed perfect. Very few neighbors, no traffic, barely any cell service. But what really sold me was the lack of noise. Just me and the silence. For the first time in months, I thought I might actually feel safe. The cabin was small but cozy, exactly as the listing had described. It was built to last, with thick wooden beams and a sturdy stone fireplace. The air smelled of pine and old books, earthy and comforting like an old ski lodge. The nearest neighbor was a 10-minute walk down a narrow dirt path, but I didn't meet her right away. For the first few days, I simply soaked in the quiet. I woke up to the sound of birds instead of sirens, and at night, all I heard was the wind rustling through the trees. The world had pressed pause and I could finally breathe again. About a week after I moved in, there was a knock at my door. Without a doorbell, I knew knocks would be something I'd have to get used to. I assumed it was my neighbor, and I was right. A moderately old woman stood there, carrying a basket of preserves, like something out of a Hallmark movie. She introduced herself as Michelle and told me she lived just down the trail. Michelle was in her late 60s, with long gray hair and piercing blue eyes that seemed to see right through me. She wasn't rude, but she was blunt. She welcomed me to the woods and extended the basket toward me, practically shoving it in my hands. It wasn't exactly the warmest introduction, but I appreciated the gesture. Then she said something I will never forget. "Always keep your lanterns full, your windows shut tight, and your wits sharper than your axe." Her words felt more like a warning than advice. I nodded politely, thanked her, and stepped back inside. She lingered outside for an uncomfortably long time before finally walking away. Despite her odd demeanor, I tried to tell myself it was nice to know someone was nearby, just in case. That night, a thunderstorm rolled in, rare for Oregon but not impossible. I curled up on the couch with a book, listening to the wind howl through the trees. Some people might find that kind of isolation terrifying, but I found it peaceful. Then came the knock at the door. It wasn't just a knock, it was a pounding. Loud, forceful, and urgent. My heart started racing as that awful tingly sensation crept into my chest. I hesitated, then grabbed my flashlight and peeked through the window. It was Michelle. She was drenched from head to toe, clutching a flashlight, and before I could even speak, she blurted out, "I saw someone near your woodpile. You should know about it." A chill ran down my spine. I stepped onto the porch, shining my flashlight into the rain. Nothing but trees. I asked her if she was sure, and she nodded, her eyes darting nervously toward the forest. It was unsettling, but before I could press her further, she simply told me to be careful and walked away, unfazed by the storm. The moment she was out of sight, I realized something wasn't right. How could she have seen someone near my woodpile if her house was 10 minutes away? That meant she had already been on my property before she saw anything. That night I barely slept. And sometime after midnight, I woke to the sound of a branch snapping outside my bedroom window. I froze. My heart pounded as I crept toward the window and cautiously peeked outside. It was Michelle. She stood at the edge of the woods facing away from my house. Her long, disheveled hair made her unmistakable. I strained to see more, but with only moonlight illuminating the area, it was nearly impossible. Then she started turning around. I ducked below the window just in time. When I finally built up the courage to look again, she was gone. I couldn't sleep after that. I told myself I would stay up until sunrise. But as the hours dragged on, exhaustion crept in. Just as I was finally letting my guard down, there was another knock at the door. This time it wasn't Michelle. I peeked through the window and felt my blood run cold. A burly, bald man with a thick beard stood on my porch. Every instinct screamed at me to stay silent. I backed away slowly, retreating to the bathroom and locking the door before calling the police. As I spoke with the dispatcher, the banging on the door started, harder, louder, like someone was trying to break it down. Then the door gave way. I clutched the phone, barely breathing as I listened to him tear through my cabin, smashing glass and splintering wood. But he never came down the hall. He never checked the bathroom. After what felt like an eternity, the destruction stopped. Silence. The police arrived surprisingly fast, but by then the man was long gone. I begged them to search the woods, but they refused, saying it was too dense to navigate effectively. Desperate for answers, I convinced them to check Michelle's cabin. What we found made my stomach drop. Her cabin was abandoned. Completely. The police confirmed that no one had lived there in decades. I argued, pleaded, insisted that I had spoken to her, but they brushed me off. There were no signs of recent habitation, they said. Nothing to suggest squatters. And then they told me something that still haunts me to this day. Living in the woods is a risk you chose to take. I left the next day, but I still think about it constantly. Some of my superstitious friends believe Michelle was a spirit trying to warn me, trying to protect me. I don't believe in the paranormal, so I think it's far more likely that she and that man had been squatting in that abandoned cabin. But if that's true, why would she warn me? Why would she watch my house if she was part of it? I don't think I'll ever know.